Okay, so as an overview then for Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is basically an introduction to economics. And, when we think of what the discipline does, a definition of the discipline, you might have some memories from high school or from principles of economics. One where you just remember a lot of equations, a lot of graphs. Well, that's certainly true. Economics at its very essence is really just the science of scarcity. And what that means is that there are unlimited wants and needs, but there are only limited resources available to meet those wants and needs. Which is why you need then economics then to sort of inform how to make the best decision about what wants and needs can and should be met. Now, when we think of how we can then divide up the discipline, one of the easiest ways we can divide up the discipline would be microeconomics versus macroeconomics, right? So in Principles of Economics 1, you would have had some introduction to macroeconomics, which would be how economies as a whole make those allocation decisions for wants and needs, or how industries as a whole make those decisions, or how sets or large groups of households make those decisions. All right, and so you would focus on things like gross domestic product, inflation, unemployment, international trade. In microeconomics, which is the focus of this course, what we do is we focus on how individual households, how individual companies make optimal decisions. We're going to spend a great deal of time deriving the demand curve, deriving the supply curve. Now, so we have that one kind of distinction of what economics is, right? Is that we can distinguish it between microeconomics and macroeconomics. Another way we can think of it is that we can distinguish positive economics from normative economics. Now, positive economics is stating a fact, right, that can either be then proven true or false. So an example of a positive economic statement would be something like the unemployment rate is 9%, right? It's either true or it is not, right? And I can gather up evidence to show that it is true or not, right? It's a statement of fact. A normative economic statement is one where you say how something ought to be, or you insert your opinion, right? Your own individual assessment. So instead of saying the unemployment rate is 9%, which is a positive statement, if I said something like the unemployment rate is too high, that would be a normative statement, because you can't really prove, that what I said, that something is too high. You can't really prove whether that's true or false, right? That's my individual assessment of things. Now, obviously in this course, we're going to focus a great deal more on positive economics. This isn't Scheidingnomics, right? You're not taking this class because you want to find out my own personal opinions about economics, right? You're here to learn the facts, and that's what this course is going to focus on. So we're focusing on microeconomics, and we're focusing on positive economics. Now, a third way to think about the types of economics would be to focus on something known as paradigms, or philosophies of economic thought. Paradigms, P-A-R-A-D-I-G-M, paradigms of economic thought. And what we're trying to do there is we're trying to think about like the history of economic thought. And if you were to think about the history of economic thought, right, one of the questions we could ask is, well, how old is economics? Well, if you ask some historian of economic thought, they'd say, oh, it dates back to, the time of Aristotle or something along those lines. Well, it does. We're going to focus on things that date back to, let's say, the late 1700s. So, when we think about the discipline of economics and who its sort of first scholars are, well, one of the quick names that come up is Adam Smith, who in 1776 wrote The Wealth of Nations. And in that book, he really focused on why some countries are rich, why some countries are poor, right? And at the time, he's talking about it from the perspective of industrialized Great Britain, right? So it was undergoing fundamentally a transformation in the economy, a large amount of economic growth. What was it that gave it that kind of growth? Well, he focused on a philosophy known as laissez-faire, right, which is French for hands-off. And so he thought that the government should have a hands-off approach to economic matters, right? So you'd have limited government intervention. He also believed in specialization of labor, so that labor should focus on specific tasks in order to get a great deal done. And then finally, he believed in these sorts of embedded labor as a way to determine the value of something. Right? So an object like this pen has an amount of labor that was needed to produce this pen, and the amount of labor that was needed to produce this pen would give me an approximation of the value of it. Now, what all these kind of theories can be summarized as is classical political economy. So in classical political economy, again, we have laissez-faire, limited government intervention. We have some notion of embedded labor, and we have some notion of specialization. And this is 1776 again, Adam Smith. The other classical political economist would be Karl Marx, who in 1848 writes the Communist Manifesto. He also has a theory where labor is embodied in an object. But his difference from Adam Smith is that he believes that there are two classes within a society. There are the owners of the means of production, right? They own the factories, they own the machines that's needed to produce stuff. And so there are these capitalists, these owners of the means of production, and there are workers, those who only own their own labor. And that there's a fundamental divide between them, where the workers are always going to be exploited by those who own the means of production. Right? Without going into, deep into Marxist economic thought, which, to be honest, I don't know that much of, what I want to focus on is the fact that they both believe in this embedded theory of value. Okay, so I want to pause right here, and then we're going to pick it up with the later two theories of economic thought. Okay, so after the classical political economists with Adam Smith and Karl Marx, what we then make a transition to in the late 1800s is what's called neoclassical economics. Now, the reason why neoclassical economics is going to be important for us is because that's where the focus is going to be for this course. So that would be your other kind of circle here, right? We've got positive economics, we've got microeconomics as our focus, and we have neoclassical economics, which is our philosophical focus here. Now, in neoclassical economics, you get things like your supply and demand curve. Right, you've got this focus on an equilibrium, right, or a balance being found, right, where there's no tendency for change. And the neoclassicals covers almost like 99% of what economists are in this country. The textbook doesn't really exclusively say we're talking about neoclassical economics. They just call it economics, but it really is neoclassical economics. And then a final sort of theory of economic thought, one that you might be familiar with from your Principles of Economics 1 course, would be Keynesian economics, right? John Maynard Keynes, who in the 1930s writes a book called The Theory of Money and Interest. His focus was on how sometimes the economy isn't in equilibrium, right? Which the neoclassicals had no explanation for, right? So John Maynard Keynes is trying to find an explanation for the Great Depression. And what he finds is that this philosophy of laissez-faire, of limited government intervention, actually could be one of the causes of why you could have a sustained downturn in the economy, and why you would want then you'd have a justification for massive government intervention to get us out of a problem. That would be, right, the justification that would have been used by Bush, the second, right, in having a Bush tax cut after the 2001 recession, or Obama would use for a job plan, right, for a plan for hiring lots of workers to build public infrastructure projects. So we've got now this way of understanding what economics is, right? Got all these distinctions with, again, our focus being on positive economics, microeconomics, neoclassical economics. Now, let's then look at what it is that economics as a discipline is. I mean, economics at the end of the day is a social science, right? This is part of the general education requirements for the social sciences. But it's funny because actually social scientists, economists think of themselves not so much as social scientists, rather they think of themselves as natural scientists, right? That they're understanding a system, a closed system, where they can understand things affecting it, and then it changes, it moves the system out of balance, right? Out of equilibrium. And then the economy fixes itself, goes back to equilibrium, right? It's not much unlike a biology, right, where you could understand an organism being affected by outside forces. With that said, and with also this given focus on positive economics, right, statements of facts that have to either then be proven true or false, it would seem to be the case in that we're going to focus also a great deal of attention on the scientific method, right? Or this way that we could think of theories being, how do you form a theory and then test it, right? So, as we give an overview of the scientific method, one of the things then that we would do then is you would decide on your set of assumptions, right? That would be the equivalent of saying, I'm a neoclassical economist, so I'm going to focus on equilibrium. Everything can be understood as supply and demand. And then, after I've got those sets of assumptions, I then want to state my hypothesis in a testable fashion, right? So it could be something like, I want to look at whether if we pass this, if we pass Obama's job plan, the unemployment rate will go down, right? So I've got a clear way of now understanding, the variables that I want to measure and the direction that I think they're going to be moving in. The third step, right, is then I would then collect the data, right? So I could collect data on employment, and I could, look at the newspaper and find out whether Obama's job plan passed or not. And then after collecting the data, I would then look and see whether the how the data is reacting. Is the unemployment rate going up or down? Now, I could then revise my model if I don't find what I had expected to find. But this also brings about an important point about data, is that there's two types of relationships that exist between data variables, and that's correlation or causal relationships. So when variables are correlated, that's spelled C-O-R-R-E-L-A-T-E, when variables are correlated, that just means that we're talking about the direction that they're moving in, versus one another, right? So in this case, I could say, another way to think of it would be I could talk about the unemployment rate and the minimum wage. And let's say, one of the primary beliefs, right, let's just draw this out here, right, is that when the minimum wage goes up, that the unemployment rate goes up, right? So what we're seeing here is that we think that both of these variables move in the same direction. We have a theory about why we think one causes the other, but let's just say for right now, right, if we're just looking at these two variables and I collect data that shows that they're both moving in this direction, I could say that they are correlated with one another. They both move in the same direction, right? Or in this case, it'd be positively correlated because they move in the same direction. If instead I had found something where they were moving in opposite directions, then they would be negatively correlated. So correlation is just talking about the direction of movement of two different variables. And if the two variables are moving in the same direction, positive correlation. If they're moving in opposite directions, negative correlation. Correlation is really easy to establish. You just have to collect data and look at what direction things are moving in. Causal relationships are much more difficult to establish because here I would then, right, in our original case here where they're both moving up, I would need to show that this changed caused this to happen, right? It's an if-then statement. One thing has to happen first, and then it causes the other event to occur. It requires a lot more work to be done to show that there's a causal relationship between the two. Okay, so with all that said, one of the last things I want to talk about in this sort of first lecture is I want to talk a bit about how economies organize themselves. Because you'll notice here at this point when I've talked about economics, I've talked about, in some sense, optimal decisions being made, right? That I have these resources and I want to meet wants and needs. We haven't talked about how you would actually organize a society. Now, at the end of the day, what we're really concerned about here are, when we're organizing a society, that we're concerned about three economic questions. I'll write this out here. And those three economic questions about how we organize a society is that we're concerned about what is going to be produced, how is it going to be produced, and who is it going to be produced for? Right? So different societies would organize themselves differently to answering these three questions. Let's just look at three different ways of organizing society to answer those three questions. On the extremes, on one extreme, there is the controlled economy. What we would think of as a communist society or a extensively socialist economy, that would be one where the government decides all of those things. They decide that we're going to produce these products. They then actually own the companies, and they kind of own the workers to then produce the products, and then they issue vouchers to decide who gets things, right? There's not too many examples of pure controlled economies. Really, the only example we have today is North Korea. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the free enterprise system, but it's not really what we have here. By a free enterprise system, what we're really talking about here would be something where there's no government involvement at all. All of those decisions are decided by the market, and the government never intervenes. It's really like a true laissez-faire economy. And we really don't have too many examples of that either. Really, the only examples we have are actually the time, more or less around the time of Adam Smith for England. Well, the vast majority of economies are mixed economies, which have a mixture then of market forces and government forces, right? The U.S., for instance, is a mixed economy in the sense that, right, we have the government providing some goods and services, right? Healthcare for the aged, for the disabled, right? We have the government providing those kinds of things. In other countries, right, like Canada, healthcare is provided entirely by the government for all citizens. Right, we have government regulations for car safety here in the U.S., right? So you can't just produce any kind of car you want. You have to meet certain regulations. If I want to start a power plant, right, to produce electricity, I have to meet certain environmental regulations, right? In other countries, right, in Europe, one of the common critiques would be that they are too regulated, right, that they have too much government intervention. Even a country like China, right, is actually a mixed economy, because while the Communist Party is very strong in that economy, it also has a great deal of market forces involved. Okay. What I want to do, I guess, as a kind of a concluding comment for this chapter is say that one of the things that, when you're organizing a society, based on whether you have a mixed economy, a controlled economy, or a truly free enterprise laissez-faire economy, is that it comes down to balancing efficiency versus equity. A market system is the way to find the most efficient outcome. By efficient, I mean using the least amount of resources to produce an outcome, an output. But it might not always be the most equitable way, right? That there might be a lot of people that are denied having a certain good or service because they can't afford it, right? So the perfect example being healthcare, where, right, our human nature says that individuals should have some degree of minimal health care. Right, we're more concerned about equity than we are about efficiency, which came out right during the debates about national healthcare system. Right, is that it is going to cost more, right, and it's going to create some inefficiencies, but it may in fact create some more equity, right? And that's a debate, right? It's not that one is necessarily better than the other. It's just something that we as a society have to decide what we want. Other countries, right? Canada, France, right, most of Western Europe have made a choice for equity versus efficiency. On the other hand, right, efficiency also pushes for higher quality, right? We could almost say that, right, the U.S. has the world's best healthcare system because there's a strong profit motive to doing so. Okay, with that said, that's really my notes that I want you to focus on for Chapter 1. You should obviously read the material, but you should listen to this video and focus on what I'm emphasizing here so that you can then emphasize what's in the typed up lecture notes and what's in the textbook. I'm not going to go over the appendix, which is a mathematical appendix. But if you're not comfortable with that mathematical material, you're going to want to make sure you read over that material. Talk to me, though, as well if you still have questions about that material. Okay, so that's going to conclude Lecture 1, which is just kind of giving you an overview of Chapter 1's material.